There aren't many mythologies in the gaming industry as well known as the Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. It's one of the most popular games Nintendo has ever put out, and its influence on those who played it, who look to it for inspiration for their own projects, is immeasurable. In the decade since it hit store shelves, when put in the context of its release window, it's commonly found cited as one of the best games ever made. You know about Ocarina of Time, but the tale of its telling, how it evolved, how its developers crafted it into the game that would change a trade and an art form, that is a story less commonly told. In the early 1990s, when Nintendo shifted away from 16 bits and into the third dimension with the creation of the Nintendo 64, it was only natural for the company to create new installments for their largest franchises to back the new system. So within their entertainment, analysis, and development division, new entries of the Super Mario and Legend of Zelda series entered production. Their original plan was to release what would become Super Mario 64 as a launch title for the Nintendo 64, and then back the 64 disk drive peripheral with the new 3D Zelda game. Limitations of disc-based media and the high-performance requirements of continuously reading animations in-game ultimately forced Nintendo to drop these plans and move development for the new Zelda over to the basic N64. This may have ultimately led to the failure of the N64 disk drive, as there wasn't any significant game released as an exclusive for the peripheral. Towards the beginning of the development for this N64 entry in the Zelda mythos, it became clear that it was going to be the largest game Nintendo had ever created up until this point. Indeed, the final product ended up being around 32 megabytes in size, a number that may seem hilariously small today, but was the largest game they'd ever released at the time. Early on, the team began pushing the limits of the N64 hardware to see how ambitious they could be. Originally, the game used the same engine as Super Mario 64. However, as it became clear that it was going to be a completely different beast, a different engine was programmed to suit the development team's purposes. However, even this didn't solve all of the team's issues. The sheer size, scope, and performance requirements of the game caused many concerns within Nintendo's staff. It got to the point that Zelda creator Shigeru Miyamoto had a backup, worst-case scenario plan which would have seen Link traveling between the different areas of Hyrule through paintings in Ganondorf's castle, essentially using the villain's lair as a central hub. This structure would have been similar to that of Super Mario 64. Miyamoto has said that in the end he wouldn't have cared about the setting or story as long as players would have been able to jump into Link's boots in the third dimension. However, confining the game to Ganon's castle would have forced areas like Hyrule Field out of the game and caused features that Miyamoto loved, like horseback riding, to be massively scaled back at the very least. Though these issues ultimately worked themselves out, an homage to the original idea of a central hub remains in the title's final release. Much of the trouble with development was solved by a new approach for the company. Instead of a single director handling every part of its development, the individual aspects of the game were handled by multiple directors, with Miyamoto acting as an advisor. Miyamoto later came on board the title as another one of these directors when work progressed at a slower pace than anticipated. This new strategy is notable for introducing Eiji Aonuma to the franchise as the director of dungeon design. He would later become the warden of the entire Zelda franchise. In the end, over 120 people worked on what would become the Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time, ranging from programmers and modelers to stunt performers who were used to capture the animations for the Chanbara-inspired sword fighting. Though many of these developers were unfamiliar with the design processes involved with creating three-dimensional games, they approached it with eagerness, feeding on a passion to create something unprecedented for their company and industry. As development rolled from pre-production into full-blown production, several features that would define Ocarina of Time began to solidify. It was originally intended to be played from a first-person perspective, changing to a side-scrolling point of view when an enemy appeared to do battle, similar to Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link. However, as the idea of including two different playable Links was introduced, it was instead decided to move the camera to a third-person perspective so players could actually see the different models. Miyamoto was also persistent about including a young version of Link, mostly because he didn't want the newly matured adult Link to be too big of a step away from the player characters of the original Zelda and A Link to the Past. The modern interpretation of Link was defined in Ocarina of Time, and current games in the franchise still look to this version of the character as inspiration for their character designs. Interestingly, when what would become Ocarina of Time was first shown to the public in the form of a tech demo, Link closely resembled his incarnations from the NES Zelda games, complete with a pointy nose and brunette head of hair. It was decided to tweak his appearance into the more handsome blonde of the final product after the wife of director Yoshiaki Koizumi questioned why Nintendo didn't have any good-looking characters. Still, Miyamoto insisted that he keep some of his goofy charm, explaining, "I thought if we made him too cool, he wouldn't be Link anymore." Because of the large environments included in the game, the development team wanted a way for Link to quickly cross the world map. For this reason, they wished to introduce horseback riding to the title, and gave Link a stallion companion in Epona. Originally, they feared that this feature would have to be cut because it weighed too heavily on the N64's processing power, but after some strong lobbying and several long nights by team members, he was reinstated. Miyamoto joked that, after showing horses in a public demo at Space World, they had to include them in the final product. Interestingly, after the feature was implemented, Miyamoto also felt it necessitated the inclusion of a huge, wide-open area like Hyrule Field. He explained, "The moment we saw you could ride around on a horse in 3D, we instantly realized that we needed a giant field that people could ride through." Epona has since become an iconic part of the Zelda mythology and has reappeared in multiple titles. Perhaps the most important new feature added in Ocarina of Time was Z-targeting, a system that made it much easier to continually target enemies while focusing the camera on them, all with just a push of the button. This feature was largely inspired after directors Toru Osawa and Yoshiaki Koizumi watched a show at the Toei Kyoto Studio Park, and focused on completely different things during the same event. Z-targeting wasn't the only feature added because of the jump to 3 dimensions. A so-called fairy navigation system was also introduced, personified with a character named Navi. Her creation would lay the foundation for future games to include similar companions to varying degrees of success. The inclusion of 2 different Links from 2 different periods of time also allowed Nintendo to experiment with the storytelling in this new game. Miyamoto explained that when Link and Zelda are children, they are innocent and able to see through Ganondorf's guise for the villain that he truly is. Forcing Link to literally grow up to face his destiny also allowed Nintendo to convey themes like the loss of childhood innocence through the environmental storytelling present within the 2 versions of Hyrule. In many ways, this reflected the gamers who played the first Zelda games years before as children, but had now grown up into adults during the period of Ocarina of Time's release. To add to this environmental storytelling, Miyamoto wanted to populate the world of Hyrule with a plethora of assorted unique characters. This was mostly inspired by the David Lynch television series Twin Peaks, of which Miyamoto was a fan. He believed that the most interesting aspect of Twin Peaks wasn't how the story was told, but rather the characters that appeared and interacted with the protagonist within the story. Despite Miyamoto's insistence that it wasn't a priority, Ocarina of Time was the first of Nintendo's marquee flagship video games to embrace storytelling in a big way. The story was written by Miyamoto and Koizumi, while Osawa designed the scenario around their ideas. Ocarina was also the first Nintendo title to have several critically important story-driven cutscenes. They were directed by Takami Kawagui, a fan of movies who was working on the development team, and were rendered in real time so changes could be made at the last minute if necessary. Though this was the first Zelda title to have its story take such a prominent role, it wasn't the first that Nintendo put thought into. Even before Ocarina's release, the developers of the series put tremendous effort into making the stories and worlds of the Legend of Zelda titles align, and Ocarina of Time would become a defining title in the canonical Zelda timeline. Music also plays a huge role in the game, as to be expected from a title with an instrument in its name. Each of the songs present within Ocarina of Time, masterfully composed by Koji Kondo, had to be simple enough to be conveyed in just 5 notes, but robust enough to be built upon into epic pieces. Many of the songs introduced in Ocarina of Time have become staples of the series and remain amongst the most recognizable music in the entire industry. Anticipation for Ocarina of Time during its development was so great that Miyamoto recalled being pleaded by clerks at convenience stores to return to his office and resume work on the game so that they could play it sooner. After 2.5 years in development, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time was finally released on November 21st, 1998 in Japan, and just 2 days later in North America. It was released the following month in the rest of the world. North American gamers who pre-ordered the title received a limited edition golden cartridge, which has become an iconic part of any N64 collector's library. Demand for the title before its release was so high that several electronics stores stopped pre-selling it in its entirety because they were unsure if they could meet consumer expectation. Ocarina of Time ended up selling more than 7.6 million copies worldwide during its run. critical reception was unreal, with Ocarina of Time receiving multiple perfect scores from outlets around the world, including the first such score from the notoriously harsh Famitsu magazine. Many critics still consider it to be a landmark title and perhaps one of the greatest games of all time. Really, the only criticism levied at Ocarina of Time during the era of its release was the result of the unintentional inclusion of religious prayers and iconography, later removed in future versions of the game. Even other staff at Nintendo were itching to play the game. Former Nintendo president Satoru Iwata remembered excitedly taking the time to buy and play a copy near the completion of the development of Super Smash Bros. He firmly believed that Ocarina of Time established the essence of what it meant to be a Zelda game. Perhaps more importantly, the developers of Ocarina of Time remain proud of their accomplishments within the title on a personal and professional level. Miyamoto recalled that, "It was the first game my daughter sat down and played a lot of, and as a result of that she became a really big Zelda fan. I remember Ocarina of Time as the game that allowed my daughter and I to start having a lot of conversations about video games." With a game like The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, it's easy to look back and see the cracks in its facade today. I think it's pretty fair to say that it hasn't aged very well. A lot of games from that era have suffered similar, if not worse, fates. But when you look at The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time in the vacuum of its release, measuring what it accomplished with the technology and developmental ideas available, it becomes clear that much of its praise was fairly given. It created many of the conventions that future games would be entirely built around. And many of those modern titles, games that you could argue are better than Nintendo's first foray into the epic adventures of the third dimension, only exist because they were built on the backs of giants such as this. Hey, thanks for watching our look back at the development of The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. If you have any suggestions for future games you want us to cover like this, please leave a comment below or tweet them at me at ForestFirst. And as always, don't forget to subscribe to the Game Theorists for more retrospectives, theories, and cultural analyses. And if you want to know more about the development of one of Nintendo's biggest games, check out our video on the development of Super Smash Bros. Melee. That game almost didn't happen, guys, and that's crazy to think about.